The sun was setting on a busy Thursday evening when a young high school student walked into the local McDonald's, her debate team badge still pinned to her jacket. She had just finished leading her team to victory in the regional championships, and the smell of French fries was too tempting to resist. Her parents had always taught her to celebrate small wins, and today's win definitely deserved a treat. The restaurant was packed with the usual evening crowd: families with tired kids, office workers grabbing dinner, and teenagers hanging out after school. Behind the counter, a new employee named Ray was halfway through his first week on the job, still nervous about handling the rush hour crowd. He kept glancing at a note his manager had left about watching out for credit card fraud, which had been happening a lot in the area lately. The young student pulled out her phone, double-checking her parents' text giving her permission to use the family credit card for dinner. She had earned this celebration not just for today's debate win, but for maintaining her position as one of the top students in her class. Standing in line, she couldn't help but smile, thinking about how proud her mom would be when she told her about how she had handled the opposition's arguments. That's when everything changed. 2 police officers walked in, responding to a call about suspicious activity. Officer Wilson, a tall man with graying hair at his temples, had been on the force for 15 years. His partner, Officer Chen, was newer to the job, but already known for his attention to detail. They scanned the crowded restaurant, their eyes eventually settling on the girl in the debate team jacket. The atmosphere in the restaurant shifted. Parents pulled their children closer, teenagers lowered their phones to watch, and the evening chatter died down to whispers. The girl was still looking at her phone, unaware that she had become the center of attention. Ray, the new employee, had made a split-second decision that would change multiple lives that evening. Earlier, he had seen a notification about a stolen credit card and, in his nervousness to prove himself useful, had called the police when he saw the young student's card, jumping to conclusions without any real evidence. The girl finally reached the counter, smiling as she prepared to order. "Hi, I'd like a Big Mac meal with," she started to say, but was cut off by Officer Wilson's stern voice behind her. "Miss, we need you to step aside for a moment." The confusion on her face was clear as she turned around. Here she was, still riding high from her debate victory, only to find herself face to face with 2 police officers. She had no idea that Ray had already told them she matched the description of someone using stolen credit cards in the area. The evening light streaming through the windows cast long shadows across the restaurant floor as time seemed to freeze. Customers stopped mid-bite, watching the scene unfold. The girl's debate team badge caught the light, a small reminder of the achievement that had brought her here just minutes ago. Officer Chen noticed something was off about the situation: the girl's confident posture, her school activities badge, the way she carried herself. But before he could voice his concerns, his partner had already started the standard procedure for a reported fraud case. The security cameras quietly recorded everything: the girl's initial confusion, the officer's approach, the stunned faces of other customers, and Ray's growing uncertainty behind the counter as he watched the situation he had set in motion spiral out of control. What should have been a simple celebratory dinner was about to become something much bigger. A moment that would spark conversations across the city and change how an entire police department approached their work. But right then, standing in that McDonald's with all eyes on her, the young student could only think one thing: this can't be happening to me. The smell of French fries still filled the air, but now it mixed with the tension that had suddenly taken over the restaurant. No one knew it yet, but this moment would lead to revelations that would surprise everyone involved, from the nervous new employee to the veteran police officer, from the watching customers to the young student herself. As Officer Wilson began to reach for his handcuffs, the girl stood perfectly still, her mind racing through every lesson her parents had taught her about staying calm in difficult situations. She had just won a debate competition by keeping her cool under pressure, but this was a very different kind of test, one that would end up teaching everyone present some unexpected lessons about truth, justice, and the power of looking beyond first impressions. The cold metal of the handcuffs felt surreal against the young student's wrists. Just moments ago, she had been thinking about her debate victory. Now, she was being led through a crowded McDonald's while strangers recorded everything on their phones. Her debate team badge swung back and forth with each step, a bitter reminder of how quickly joy could turn to confusion and fear. "There must be some mistake," she said, her voice steady despite the situation. Years of debate training had taught her to stay calm under pressure, but this was far different from any challenge she had faced before. "The card belongs to my parents. I have permission to use it." Officer Wilson's grip on her arm remained firm. "We'll sort this out at the station," he said, but there was a slight hesitation in his voice. Something about the girl's composure didn't match what he usually saw in fraud cases. Behind him, Officer Chen was already pulling out his phone, a nagging doubt growing in his mind. The crowd in the restaurant had grown silent, save for the subtle sounds of phone cameras recording. A young mother pulled her children close, whispering something in their ears. An elderly man stood up from his seat, his hand gripping his cane tightly as he watched the scene unfold. Even the usual kitchen noise had died down as the staff gathered near the counter, watching their new coworker Ray grow increasingly pale. "Can I at least call my parents?" the student asked, maintaining her dignity even as she was being led toward the door. "They can verify everything I'm telling you." Her voice carried across the now silent restaurant, clear and composed, making several customers exchange uncomfortable glances. Officer Chen stepped forward. "We should check her phone," he suggested to his partner. "If she has messages from her parents about the card." But before he could finish, the restaurant's door chimed. A group of the girls' debate teammates had just walked in, stopping dead in their tracks at the sight before them. "What are you doing?" one of them called out, their debate team jackets matching the one the girl was wearing. "She's our team captain. We just won regionals." Their voices added to the growing tension in the restaurant, phones still recording every moment. Ray, the new employee who had made the initial call, was now visibly shaking behind the counter. His manager had stepped out from the back office, asking him in hushed tones what exactly he had seen that made him so sure about the fraud. With each question, Ray's certainty crumbled further. The student took a deep breath, years of public speaking experience helping her maintain her composure. "Officer Wilson," she said, her voice clear and respectful despite the circumstances, "I understand you're doing your job. But I can prove this is a mistake if you'll just let me show you my phone and call my parents." The evening light through the windows had grown dimmer, casting long shadows across the restaurant floor. The smell of fries had been replaced by the heavy air of tension. Outside, more people had gathered, drawn by the commotion visible through the large windows. Officer Chen was already pulling up something on his phone, his expression growing increasingly concerned. The description they had received of the fraud suspect wasn't matching up with several key details. The reported incidents had happened when the debate team was provably in competition across town. A soft ding from the kitchen timer seemed unusually loud in the tense atmosphere. Someone's abandoned order sat getting cold on the counter, the receipt showing a time just minutes before everything had changed. The student's own order hadn't even been placed yet, a celebration dinner turning into something she never could have expected. Through it all, she stood straight, her debate team badge catching the light. Her teammates had moved closer, phones out, recording everything just like the other customers. They had just spent the afternoon arguing about justice and civil rights in their winning debate round, none of them expecting to see these principles tested so personally hours later. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air. Every person in that McDonald's knew they were watching something important unfold. A moment that would be shared, discussed, and remembered long after the evening ended. But for the young student in handcuffs, it wasn't about becoming a viral video or making a statement. It was about standing in her truth, maintaining her dignity, and trusting that the facts would eventually come to light. As Officer Wilson reached for his radio to call in a verification check, the student caught sight of her reflection in the darkened window. She saw what everyone else in the restaurant saw: a young girl in a debate team jacket, handcuffed but unbroken, facing an injustice with remarkable grace. What no one could see was her heart pounding beneath her calm exterior, or the way she kept repeating her father's words in her mind. The truth always comes out in the end. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed overhead as Officer Chen sat at his computer, his fingers flying across the keyboard. With each new piece of information he uncovered, the knot in his stomach grew tighter. The young student sat quietly in the interview room next door, her debate team jacket folded neatly on the chair beside her. "You need to see this," Officer Chen called to his partner, who was just returning with a cup of water for their detainee. On the screen was the security footage from McDonald's, showing not just the events of that evening, but footage from the past week. The actual credit card thief, they discovered, had been operating during the morning shift, when their young student was probably sitting in her AP chemistry class. In the interview room, the student's phone lay on the table, displaying dozens of missed calls from worried parents. A text message thread was open, clearly showing her mom's permission to use the card for dinner. Next to it sat her debate team schedule, proving she had been across town competing when several of the reported thefts occurred. Officer Wilson rubbed his temples, the weight of their mistake becoming clearer with each passing minute. "We need to call her parents," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "And we need to figure out how this went so wrong." Meanwhile, back at McDonald's, Ray, the new employee, was sitting in the manager's office, his hands shaking as he tried to explain his actions. "I was just trying to be vigilant," he stammered, looking at the actual security photos of the real thief that his manager had pulled up. The images showed someone who looked nothing like their wrongly accused student. The restaurant's security system had captured everything. Times, dates, transactions, all pointing to a very different suspect. The real thief had been careful, but not careful enough. They had fallen into a pattern, always striking during the morning rush when the staff was too busy to notice subtle discrepancies. Back at the station, Officer Chen was piecing together a timeline. The debate team's competition schedule, the theft reports, the security footage, everything was falling into place, but not in the way they had initially assumed. Each new detail made their hasty arrest look more and more misguided. "I found something else," called a desk sergeant, waving them over to his computer. He had pulled up the student's academic record, honor roll, debate team captain, volunteer work at the local library. She was giving a presentation at the Youth Leadership Council when one of the biggest thefts happened last week. The young student sat quietly in the interview room, her composure still intact despite everything. Through the window, she could see the officers gathering around various computers, their faces growing more concerned with each new discovery. She thought about her debate team, probably still at McDonald's, probably still recording everything, probably already sharing what had happened. Officer Wilson walked into the interview room, his steps heavy with the weight of responsibility. The student looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct. Before he could speak, she said something that would stick with him for years to come. "I know you were just doing your job, but sometimes doing your job means taking time to learn the whole truth." The truth was spreading fast. The McDonald's security footage had already been pulled by management and sent to the police station. Ray's mistake in judgment was being documented in official reports. The real thief's pattern was becoming clear, and it had nothing to do with evening visits by debate team students. Outside the interview room, phones were ringing constantly. News of the incident was spreading through social media, with videos from the McDonald's already gaining thousands of views. But unlike many viral police encounters, this one was about to take an unexpected turn. Officer Chen walked in with a stack of papers, proof after proof of the student's innocence. Bank statements showing legitimate card use, school records confirming her whereabouts, security footage timestamps that made it impossible for her to have been involved. But what struck him most was how she had maintained her dignity throughout the entire ordeal. The station's captain had arrived, taking in the scene with a mixture of concern and determination. This wasn't just about one wrong arrest anymore. This was about how snap judgments and hasty actions could spiral into something much bigger. But it was also about how truth, when finally revealed, could become a catalyst for necessary change. As the officers prepared to release her, the student stood up, picking up her debate team jacket. She didn't know it yet, but her calm handling of this situation would soon become a teaching moment for the entire police department. The truth hadn't just set her free. It was about to spark a conversation that would change how an entire community thought about assumptions, evidence, and justice. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with activity as investigators pored over security footage, witness statements, and police reports. 3 days had passed since the McDonald's incident, and what started as a simple arrest had bloomed into something much larger. The young student's story had touched a nerve in the community, spreading across social media and local news channels. Officer Wilson sat in a cramped interview room, his coffee growing cold as he rewatched the body camera footage for the 10th time. 20 years on the force hadn't prepared him for this moment of self-reflection. I saw what I expected to see, he admitted to the internal affairs investigator, his voice heavy with realization. I didn't take the time to see who was actually standing in front of me. Down the hall, Officer Chen was presenting his findings about the real credit card thief. The evidence was clear. A pattern of morning theft incidents that had nothing to do with their wrongly accused student. The real culprit had been caught that morning, making purchases at a gas station with another stolen card. Look at these timestamps, Officer Chen pointed out, spreading papers across the conference room table. Our student was in debate practice or class during every single theft. We had the evidence right there in the dispatch notes, but we didn't take time to verify before acting. Back at McDonald's, things were changing too. Ray, the new employee who made the initial call, sat in a newly organized training session with other staff members. I thought I was doing the right thing, he shared with his coworkers, his voice shaking slightly. But I let my fears and assumptions take over instead of following proper procedures. The restaurant manager had implemented new protocols for handling suspected fraud cases. We need to gather facts, not jump to conclusions, she explained to her team. What happened that night can't happen again. The security cameras that had captured everything now served as teaching tools in their training sessions. Meanwhile, the students' parents sat in the police chief's office, their daughter's debate team jacket folded neatly in her mother's lap. They weren't interested in lawsuits or settlements. We want change, her father said firmly. Real, lasting change that makes sure this doesn't happen to anyone else's child. The chief listened intently, taking notes as they spoke. On his desk lay dozens of emails and letters from community members, each sharing similar stories of snap judgments and hasty assumptions. The student's incident had opened a floodgate of conversations that needed to happen. Officer Wilson found himself in mandatory bias training, but this time it was different. Instead of just going through the motions, he was fully engaged. The instructor had pulled up the McDonald's security footage, using it as a case study. This is what happens when we let assumptions drive our actions, the instructor explained. But it's also what happens when we have the courage to admit our mistakes and learn from them. The young students' debate team had turned the incident into their next competition topic, the role of presumption of innocence in modern policing. Their coach watched proudly as they practiced, knowing that they now understood these issues on a deeply personal level. In the evidence room, Officer Chen created a new training document. It detailed how quick assumptions and rushed procedures could snowball into serious mistakes. He included screenshots from the security footage, annotated with points where different decisions could have prevented everything that followed. The local newspaper ran a feature story, not about the mistake, but about what happened afterward. They covered the changes being implemented, the conversations being had, and the way one incident was reshaping how an entire community thought about justice and judgment. Ray had written a letter of apology, which now sat on the student's kitchen table. I was scared of making mistakes, he wrote, but my fear of making one mistake led me to make an even bigger one. The student read it, understanding that, like the officers, Ray was learning hard but necessary lessons. The investigation was wrapping up, but its impact continued to ripple outward. Training programs were being revised, procedures rewritten, and most importantly, people were talking, really talking, about how to do better. The student's debate trophy sat on her shelf at home, but she had learned more about persuasion and truth in that one evening at McDonald's than in all her competitions combined. As Officer Wilson filled out his final report on the incident, he paused at the section marked Lessons Learned. There was so much to say, but he started with the simplest truth. Sometimes the most important evidence is the humanity right in front of us, if we just take the time to see it. 2 weeks after the incident, the McDonald's restaurant looked different. Gone were the tense memories of that evening, replaced by something unexpected hope. The young students sat at a table with Officers Wilson and Chen, surrounded by community members, all gathered for the first meeting of the newly formed Community Bridge program. I never thought I'd be back here, the student admitted, her debate team pin now accompanied by a new badge identifying her as the youth representative for the program. But sometimes the best way forward is through the place where everything went wrong. Officer Wilson nodded, remembering how nervous he'd been about facing the community again. But here he was, sharing his story openly with a room full of people who had come not to judge, but to learn and make things better. "We're not here to forget what happened," he explained to the group. "We're here to make sure we remember it the right way, not as just a mistake, but as the moment we all decided to do things differently." The restaurant manager had transformed the party room into a community meeting space every Tuesday evening. Tonight's topic was building trust through understanding. On the walls hung posters created by local high school students, each one addressing different aspects of community relations and mutual respect. Ray, the employee whose call had started everything, now helped train new staff members. "Before you make that call," he would tell them, "remember my story. Take a breath, check the facts, and think about the person in front of you as a human being first." The police department had undergone its own transformation. Officer Chen stood up to share the new verification protocols they developed. "We've created a simple checklist," he explained, holding up a laminated card. "But it's not just about following steps. It's about taking the time to see the whole picture." In the corner, the students' parents watched proudly as their daughter led a discussion about youth perspectives on law enforcement. The fear and anger of that night had transformed into something powerful, a voice that could help shape real change. "My dad always told me that one person can't change the world," she shared with the group, "but one person can start the conversation that changes things." That's what we're doing here, having the conversations that need to happen. The local news crew filmed quietly from the back, capturing something different from their usual stories about community-police relations. Instead of tension and conflict, they recorded people sharing meals, swapping stories, and most importantly, listening to each other. Officer Wilson's partner from another precinct watched in amazement. 2 weeks ago, this place was trending on social media for all the wrong reasons, he commented. Now look at it, people from every part of the community coming together to make things right. The students' debate team had shown up in force, not to argue points but to learn. They sat scattered throughout the room, taking notes not for competition but for real-world change. Their presence reminded everyone that the next generation was watching, learning, and ready to be part of the solution. A new training video played on the restaurant's TV screens, showing proper procedures for handling suspected fraud. But more than procedures, it emphasized the importance of treating every customer with respect and dignity. The young student's story had become part of the training, not as a cautionary tale, but as a turning point. The hardest part, Officer Wilson shared with the group, wasn't admitting we were wrong. It was realizing that we had the power to make it right, and that meant doing more than just saying sorry. It meant becoming part of the change. The meeting wrapped up with people exchanging phone numbers and making plans for next week. The restaurant staff handed out free cookies, a small gesture that somehow meant more than just snacks. It meant hospitality, welcome, and the recognition that this was now a place of healing. As the crowd began to disperse, a young kid tugged at Officer Chen's sleeve. "My mom says you made a mistake, but then you fixed it," the child said innocently. "Is that true?" Officer Chen knelt down to the child's level. "That's right," he answered. "And you know what? Sometimes fixing a mistake can lead to something even better than if the mistake had never happened at all." The student gathered her things, including a stack of suggestion cards filled out by community members. Each card represented a voice, an idea, a piece of the puzzle they were all trying to solve together. As she walked out into the evening air, she passed the spot where she had once stood in handcuffs. Now it was just another tile in the floor of a place that had become something new. A symbol of how mistakes could transform into miracles when people chose to learn, grow, and work together. The turning point. The small conference room felt heavy with tension. 2 police officers sat across from Jasmine and her mother, their faces a mix of shame and determination. The fluorescent lights seemed to spotlight every uncomfortable moment. "We were wrong," the first officer said, his voice breaking slightly. "Completely and entirely wrong." Jasmine's mother gripped her daughter's hand. After weeks of sleepless nights, angry phone calls, and endless worry, they were finally face to face with the officers who had turned their world upside down. The younger officer leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly. "What happened to you was unacceptable. We made a terrible mistake, and we want to make it right." Jasmine remembered that day at McDonald's like it was yesterday. The cold metal of handcuffs, the shocked stares of other customers, the fear that had gripped her heart. She'd done nothing wrong, nothing except being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But something was different now. These weren't the same officers who had arrested her. These were people trying to understand, trying to repair the damage they'd caused. "I was studying for my college entrance exams," Jasmine said softly. "I've worked so hard to get where I am." That day could have destroyed everything. The room fell silent. The weight of those words hung in the air, a reminder of how one moment of prejudice could derail an entire life. The older officer pulled out a folder. "We've documented everything. The department is taking full responsibility. There will be a formal investigation, and we're pushing for comprehensive training to prevent this from happening again." Jasmine's mother spoke up, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "This isn't just about an apology. This is about changing a system that sees my daughter as a threat before seeing her as a person." The conversation wasn't easy. They talked about racial profiling, about unconscious bias, about the fear that black families live with every day. No one held back. No one tried to sugarcoat the truth. As hours passed, something unexpected happened. The walls began to come down. The officers shared their own stories of growing up, of becoming police officers, of wanting to make a difference. Jasmine talked about her dreams of becoming a doctor, about the community work she did, about her hopes for the future. They weren't just a victim and her accusers anymore. They were becoming human to each other. By the end of the meeting, something had shifted. The department wasn't just offering a settlement. They were offering real change. Jasmine would receive support for her college education. The officers would undergo extensive training and would work with local community groups to develop better understanding and communication. "I don't want this to be about revenge," Jasmine said as they were preparing to leave. "I want this to be about making things better for the next person." Her mother squeezed her hand, pride shining in her eyes. The officers looked at each other, a silent understanding passing between them. Outside the conference room, the world continued. But inside, something powerful had happened. A conversation that could have been filled with anger and resentment had instead become a bridge of understanding. As they walked out, Jasmine knew her life would never be the same. Not because of what had happened to her, but because of how she chose to respond. She wasn't just a victim, she was a catalyst for change. The story wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. A new beginning. The community center was packed. People from all walks of life, young and old, from different backgrounds and neighborhoods, had come together. At the front of the room stood Jasmine, her hands slightly trembling, but her voice strong and clear. "It's not about blaming," she began. "It's about understanding." Her story was more than just what happened that day at McDonald's. It was about hope, about change, about breaking cycles that had gone on for far too long. The local police department had changed too. They weren't just paying lip service to diversity training. They were making real, meaningful shifts. The two officers who had wrongly arrested Jasmine were now working directly with community outreach programs, sharing their story of growth and learning. Jasmine's mother sat in the front row, watching her daughter with tears in her eyes. She remembered the scared teenager from months ago, the one who had been handcuffed, humiliated, treated like a criminal. Now, her daughter was standing tall, turning pain into purpose. Community leaders nodded as Jasmine spoke. Local schools started inviting her to share her experience. She wasn't just telling a story of injustice, she was showing a path forward. Young students would lean in, listening to every word, seeing someone who had faced a terrible situation and chosen to create something positive. The police department's approach was changing. They were implementing new training programs that went beyond simple diversity workshops. Officers were learning about unconscious bias, about the real experiences of communities of color. They were being taught to see people, really see them, before making any judgments. Jasmine's scholarship fund became something more than just financial support. It was a beacon of hope for other young students who might face similar challenges. Local businesses started contributing, schools became more involved, and what began as a personal story became a community movement. "I could have been angry," Jasmine told a group of high school students during one of her talks. "And believe me, I was angry. But anger alone doesn't create change. Understanding does." The two officers who had arrested her became unexpected allies. They spoke at training sessions, sharing their own journey of understanding. They talked about the moment they realized their mistake, about how important it is to question your own biases. One evening, after a community meeting, an elderly woman approached Jasmine. Her eyes were kind, filled with a lifetime of experiences. "You're doing something important," she said, touching Jasmine's hand. "You're building bridges where others see walls." The ripple effect was real. Local policy began to change. Police procedures were scrutinized. Community relationships improved. It wasn't perfect, nothing ever is, but it was progress. Jasmine continued her studies, her dream of becoming a doctor still burning bright. But now she had something extra, a mission, to heal not just individual patients, but to help heal community wounds. Years later, when people talked about that day at McDonald's, it wasn't just a story of her own. It was a story of how one moment can spark real, lasting change, how understanding can triumph over fear, how a single voice can make a difference. As Jasmine looked out at another packed community center, she smiled. The journey wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning.